All right, I think we're at a good point now with people that are entering. So welcome to this talk. My name's Aldrin Peary. I'm a member of the Apache Nifi PMC, and I'm going to talk to you about Apache Nifi, Minifi, and the kind of ecosystem that's budding up around that. So as a kind of rough agenda of what we're going to cover, we're going to do a quick overview of Apache Nifi fundamentals, talk about how we were extending the reach of Nifi and why we want to do that with Minifi, a child project, the evolution of the Nifi ecosystem, and the introduction of something called Apache Nifi Registry. Going to close everything up by talking about the Apache Nifi community and how you can get involved and learn more if you're interested. So just to kind of set expectations and kind of ground your thought process on the course of the conversation, the kind of core focus that the Apache Nifi community has is to empower users to manage the collection and flow of data. That's it. There's a lot of things involved with that, but we try and be very good at one thing, and that's have a good user experience, a good operational experience to empower people to do good things with moving data from point A to point B and however many other points there are. And so as we kind of step through this, we're going to highlight the kind of journey that we went through as a community, how we kind of learned new needs from our users, and how that kind of shaped and built Nifi into what it is today and what we hope it'll be in the future. The core problem at hand is this notion of taking things from whatever these producers are across that lovely little pipe called the internet and whatever kind of network you may have to consumers, right? It's a simple producer-consumer problem. Obviously, it's not just a straight line. There's a lot of different places where this tees off and goes to various other places. The types of producers can vary greatly. We can talk about fun things like IoT. We can talk about some of the tried and true staples of enterprise in terms of enterprise database systems. So it encompasses all of that, right? And they all have their kind of own formats and types of data that we're dealing with at their different velocities and sizes. And we want to be amenable to taking all those things in and providing them to whoever needs them, whether that's some other system, some user, or even other systems that can do things with them, cultivate their own data based on those items, and then ship it back out to some other place. And so we always like to think of this very simple process of take these bits, put them over here. But it's hard when we start thinking about all the things that are involved with this. There's the sheer matters of challenge of scale and things like that, but there's also kind of the soft factors that we try to reason about, working with other teams, other organizations. If I'm a large enterprise, I have partners. I may find myself in possession of a new company, and they have their own data formats. How do we kind of wrap this all up into a nice package that's easy to understand? We always have this idea of like, I could do things so much better. I'm going to have this one standard that will rule them all. And at the end of the day, well, that's just not how the realities of things work. Things change, and I have to be flexible to those. So I really like this kind of comic to emphasize that kind of point that's going through it. So as a quick overview of what Apache Nifi is about, there's several of the items that are illustrated here, but kind of looking at the lineage and the history of where Nifi came from, there's a large enterprise, a large organization that had every system you can imagine. It had scripts, it had different teams, all working at their own kind of cadences. And so it was a little microcosm of this kind of broader system, broader enterprise. And we had to bring all these items together. And so it brought about a lot of needs for these types of items. I had to be very responsive to things when they arose. Things change. It wasn't this kind of nice walled garden construct where I have one data format, one language that was kind of the unifier across the entirety of my organization. And so we wanted to ensure that the data got to where it needed to be in the face of adversity for when that system inevitably goes down, whether it's because we've hit too much scale, that one guy just messed the one system up, or something else happened. We want to be resilient. So we want to buffer the data, be able to have back pressure and push back on systems that are causing issues downstream, and also have a way of relieving ourselves, right? We always like to think about having all the data right away, right now, but it doesn't really work like that. At some point, we have to make conscientious efforts to stem the tide when it's just not feasible to have all that information. So that's where prioritization comes in as well, and quality of service for those types of items. I'll talk about this a little bit more on some upcoming slides, but data provenance was a big thing for us as well. Understanding the path, the transformations, and the changes that my data went through to get to the point where it is now. It gives a really rich set of metadata that tells an interesting story about how my systems are performing, how long it's taken for me to get to this point, how long certain processes are working against the system, and what the impact has on me operationally. One of the big things that we look at too is this idea of visual command and control. While a lot of people have come to use Nifi that are developers and very technically inclined, and want to get in the code and mess with XML or mess with configuration and make their own processors, we also wanted a tool that was for folks that were very good at operations, keeping things running. When things go bump in the night, the people that responded to make things better and resolve the issues in the morning that didn't necessarily know about that one developer's crazy archaic config system that was the best thing ever, but really wasn't. We wanted to have a way of sharing things, flow templates, and that was a nice way to kind of shift things around and move things through our organization. If I created a best practice way of doing something, I could share that. And that's worked pretty well, but there's also some kind of growing pains there, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's going to change, how it's going to evolve. We want to be flexible in terms of roles and security for multi-tenancy, allowing different systems and users to integrate and have different privileges within that environment. We want to be designed for extension. We want to give a nice set of core utilities that accomplish a lot of good, but also allow other folks that have their specific needs to their organization and allow them to extend on the platform and build on the goodness that's there already with as little effort as possible. Finally, clustering is very important for the notion of scaling up. Usually one machine is not going to take care of all my things when I'm dealing with this big data. So how can I scale up in a nice fashion that allows me to process even larger amounts? Nifi itself is based on flow-based programming. We won't get too into the details of what all these things mean, but some of the important terms are that I have a flow file. You can think of this as the event or message that's going through my system. Even though it says flow file, we don't deal strictly with files. It's anything that can be represented in a binary format. The best way to reason about these, if you're familiar with how HTTP data is sent, is this notion of a set of attributes and then a binary payload. This is a very similar, same concept that goes through Nifi, and we have a lot of neat stuff that's built into it that we won't quite get into today that helps us be very efficient and very good at this problem of data flow. We have this idea of flow file processor. And this is the box where the action kind of happens. This is the thing that's integrating with other systems, it's handling formats, it's performing conversions. It's this nice, very functional, I take some input, I do something to it, and I send it down one or more relationships that allow me to then connect those processors with other processors, and with that I get a directed graph of processing. The flow controller is kind of the orchestrator of this whole system. It looks at managing resource allocation, scheduling, moving things from point to point throughout that directed graph. And then process groups provide nice logical abstractions of underlying components. So if I have a set of 5 processors that carry out the process of geo-enrichment, and that's the way I do it for everything, I can abstract those into one kind of larger Uber processor that acts as this process group. So I see flow files going into this process group, and then flow files coming out the other side that have had my organization's practices for geo-enrichment applied to them. Nifi itself is data agnostic, and so a lot of people like to talk about data agnosticism, which is great. And so we are too. We don't really care about the data, but at the same time, we know that you ultimately care about the data, right? You're bringing it in, you're doing things with it. You need ways of interacting with it. And so with that in mind, we want to kind of give a lot of the utility that you need to do the core functions. So there's certain protocols that are very popular, certain data formats. Let's have those out of the box. But of course, my organization also has certain ways of doing it that are there that predate me and the guy before him and the person before them. So I need to have a way to extend, and so that's where the extensibility comes in. One of the things I like to think of, and I think is greatly applicable to Nifi, not just the application, but kind of the community and ecosystem, is a robustness principle. And it says, be conservative in what you do, but liberal in what you accept from others. As we kind of talked about earlier, there's a lot of nuance and hidden challenge in how we handle data flow and moving things around. Things are really never that simple. And so we need some point that's going to be the platform that allows me to get things in the format they need to be, in the kind of volume and the time they need to be to the systems that need it. We're kind of this nice mediation tool that smooths out the rough edges of data that's coming from whatever system, whatever producer, and gets it to where it needs to go. And so this is just kind of a nice way of thinking about things, and also kind of opening up us as a platform to be very applicable to a large variety of situations, again, for that core focus of managing data flow. The sessions we have are a little short on time, so if you haven't seen Nifi before, this is a kind of quick view of the canvas, right? This is a real-time operating canvas. You'll see numbers that are coming through here, and it reflects the way that the data is moving through your system. The numbers that you see there are a live representation of your stats and how the system is performing. You'll see here that we have processors, these lighter color boxes that are connected to other processors to create this directed graph of processing. Those larger boxes with the kind of grayish-blue headline on them are the processing groups, right? In those, they are abstractions of other processors. And so we have ways of doing things. In this case, this is a simple flow that we have on our site that shows kind of a typical Lambda architecture. We have things that are going off to batch systems, and we have things that are going off to streaming systems. And Nifi is kind of acting as a substrate for this particular process to take data from various different sources and get it to where it needs to be in the format it needs to be in. A very kind of quick example we give is HDFS, for instance, has a certain block size. So when we want to store things in that system, we want to ensure that we have bundles that are appropriate sizing so we're not wasteful of space. Meanwhile, for streaming systems, when we're feeding to Kafka or Storm or Spark, we want smaller messages that get there as fast as possible. So we don't necessarily batch those up. We send those things off right away. And so this is kind of nice. Operationally as a user, if I'm not necessarily an expert with Java, but I understand how the systems work and what needs to happen and who needs data, I get a lot of nice, quick responses to understand how things are working. In the case that there's an issue, you'll see one item there has a little red box indicating there's an issue. So I can look at that as an operator and say, hey, something's going on. I can evaluate. There's no design deploy of this particular mechanism. I can then make a change. So if that one system went down because that one team can never quite get their stuff together, I can route that around and handle it in the meantime so it doesn't affect other systems in my processing. And so this is pretty nice, I have this kind of notional view of how things are working. But I mentioned the idea of provenance. And so provenance is this idea of custody and the lineage of a piece of data as it makes its way through its system. And so here's an expanded kind of graph, right? So each one of these represents a specific event where a flow file, as it was making its way through its processing graph, had some action happen to it. And there's a few kind of simple verbs that go with provenance. You'll see things like receive, attributes modified, clone, fork, right? And this is kind of how data is traversing your system. Mapping this to that prior image, I have a way of traversing my infrastructure and understanding what was going on with the systems. Looking at the events associated with this, I get information like the time it was in my processing system, how long it spent at a particular node in that overall processing flow, and it operates a very nice kind of picture that I can understand how things are behaving. Do I have enough resources for this one thing I consider critical? Am I pushing things through quickly enough? How can I change my quality of service so I get things through faster to my streaming systems? Can I sacrifice a little bit more for my batch systems? And so this was really neat because Nifi was kind of an interesting place in the overall kind of ecosystem, right? We touched a lot of systems, so it gave us a lot of neat insights into how Nifi interact with those systems, right? So we got very interesting data paths that came through here. But over time, people are like, wow, this provenance stuff is great. I can see what's happening, but what happens before I receive it? What's going on with that data in the process there, right? This lands in my system, but there could be a very compelling and interesting story about how things got here up to that point. And so that's where we start looking at extending the reach. And this is where the notion of Apache Nifi, Minifi, comes in. And the idea here is let me get the key parts of Nifi close to where data begins. I'm looking at getting bidirectional data transfer. So not only sending things to my system, to Nifi, to land it there and pass it through my organization, but also pass information back to it, right? If I have things I learned from doing that very impressive stuff with my very impressive processing systems, let me distill that down, and I can use that in the flow as a referenceable data set to kind of make some decisions about things. Over time, I may find I don't really care about a certain type of data, so let me just drop it there. I can be more efficient in how I use my limited resources. Again, we want all the data right now, right away, but it doesn't really work. In the romanticized world of kind of big data, we would get all of that, but we can't. So let's be able to discern what's important to us and what isn't. Additionally, this is helping greater illuminate the journey with provenance, right? So not only am I making some of these decisions and choosing how processing happens where data is incepted, I can now start emitting some events, right? And start crafting that story about how long certain things are taking. Best way to kind of summarize this, and the way I like to think about it, is that Nifi lives in the data center. Give me a server or a cluster of servers, and I will consume them in their totality. I want all the resources. I'm going to own that system. Other things can work with it, but it works best if Nifi gets to kind of use all the resources on that system. Minifi lives closer to where the data is born and is a guest in that system. So I don't necessarily get all access to those things. That doesn't preclude us from doing that. Maybe we do want to do more things, more impressive things that require more processing, more resources. But we have to start small, and we can grow later to get bigger and do more processing at that point in time. So again, we're kind of dealing with some of these realities of living outside our walled garden, our cozy data center that we have there. A lot of things are limited. Again, things like computing capability, the power and network with them, network availability, if it's even there. We're looking at different network enclaves, so things are separated across different security boundaries. How do I traverse those things? How to make use of that? I have no UI. I can't necessarily make a change to something, right? So the model shifts from being this interactive command and control mechanism to a design deploy one. I have some kind of declarative configuration that I push out or make use of with that agent, and then use that to control my processing. Some other kind of challenges that go associated with that. And so this is kind of emerging in a few different ways. And within the Apache Nifi community, we have a few different efforts that are underway currently to address some of these things. We have our kind of choose your own size, choose your own adventure with the offerings that are going through here. The first one is going small, doing it in Java. And the best way to think about this is let me take kind of the core Nifi engine and that code base that's been developed by the community and before that for quite some time, strip off the bits that don't apply to me. Again, we're dealing with these realities where I don't have access to things potentially, so remove the web server, remove all these components that I'm not going to be dealing with, and then use that common engine to kind of get a little smaller. It has pretty good feature parity with the actual core Nifi libraries. Going beyond that, though, and we're starting to get into some of these applications where people like to think about the fun that's IoT and those types of applications. We're going with C++. In this case, we're writing once with a lot of macros and definitions, and then running that anywhere. But we're being capable of running any place that we can run C++ on it. So let's get this much smaller size. Feature parity will not necessarily ever be there. We're going with smaller extensions and very focused kind of efforts to kind of get the core functionality that makes sense for those applications. And then finally, there's the idea of maybe going even smaller than that. Thinking of like client libraries, maybe language-specific SDKs. Sometimes we can't necessarily control the application. We can't run another process on that system. But I like the idea of being able to get some of these functionalities and being able to talk to Nifi, have my application that's running on some device or some other application integrated so that I can send things off to Nifi, have things onboarded into that, generate provenance from it, have it in the flow file format, make use of the site-to-site protocol that helps me talk between machines. And so as I mentioned, we have no UI. It's a declarative configuration, and this is currently the state of things. We have a YAML configuration file. We'll talk a little bit about some of the pain points that have come from this. Initially, when the notion of Minifi came around, it's for this kind of agent model, a very kind of simple, well-composed process where I think of, let me do something like tail this file, get files from a certain directory, and then ship them across the wire to some landing spot. But our community was pretty bold, and they started doing things. I'm like, well, I can do this other stuff too, and it brought about some interesting ways and some considerations that we hadn't really thought of. People wanted to end up running actual kind of full-blown, what we consider Nifi flows closer to where that data was happening. They're okay that it was using more processing power and doing more, but the configuration kind of grew a little more crazy. There's a lot more properties going with it, and they wanted to also have that kind of configuration going through there. So while we were good about reducing the kind of initial size and the number of components with it, there was kind of a need being expressed that we wanted to address. And so no one likes slinging around several hundred lines of YAML or NER configuration file. And so what people were really looking for is a way to kind of control these systems. And so to kind of facilitate that, the first cut of this was, let's take a template that we have in Nifi that has some kind of flow, perform a transformation process that maps it into this YAML configuration that Minifi, C++, and Java can comprehend and consume, and then make use of that. And that was okay, but it wasn't something that we're necessarily proud of and felt good about. So this brings about the idea of centralized command and control. And there's some efforts underway now from a design and development perspective in the Apache community to come up with some prototypical servers. Let me smooth over some of this process. Let me not go from a template to another file format to another file format. Instead, let me talk with maybe some source repository that I have there, and then make it available to agents. I can then pull from them. And so I can poll and look for updates to my server, say, oh, there's a new configuration that I should consume. Let me bring this down, roll over, and kick over to that new kind of processing configuration. Let me adjust the way I'm behaving and change the way my flow is constructing things. And so we've done some initial work with that, and that's pretty great. But we'd also like to then extend that to the point where we're providing a similar user interface and experience that we have with Nifi. We like the idea of cognitively having a very similar experience between both of them, mapping the interactive command control nature that Nifi has currently to that of the design deploy experience that we're looking at exploring with Minifi itself. And so the idea here is that we've gotten pretty good at completing the story, connecting the drops between Minifi, at wherever you want to call it, the edge, you want to call it where data is created, source systems, whatever it may be, and then having it pass through the Nifi. And your architecture can vary. There may be multiple hops of Minifi instances, some a little more feature-rich and powerful than others, maybe multiple kind of Nifi points. But the idea is that we're generating data, we're sending that data, and collecting that data, and passing it through to Nifi itself, so I can pass it on to the rest of my organization. With that, not only am I getting the data, I'm additionally getting the provenance associated with it. And so I'm getting a full history and lineage of the data from the point where it's created to the point where it's consumed. And we're lighting up that much more of the map to kind of understand how things are working. I always like to kind of map it to this idea of a courier service. If you think about your typical parcel delivery, they have a architecture and kind of layout from a physical brick and mortar standpoint that maps pretty well to this notion. Think of them and their multiple physical stores. They have places where they're accepting packages. Think of it as your data. They have various other vehicles and such that are out on the road delivering things, checking when they get someplace, updating the tracking that's associated with them, generating their own set of data. And then regionally, they'll have distribution hubs. Well, their data may also coincide with that, kind of rolling up from a regional perspective before it makes it back to a core data center at headquarters. With these, we can see places where a client library might make sense. If I want to embed something on the scanners that are checking packages in or scanning them for their last bit before they're dropped on someone's doorstep, I don't necessarily get to run their process there, but I can maybe integrate with the software that's associated with it. Trucks may have a little bit more capability with them. They may have some smaller, SoC type computers. And then I can also have gateway servers that kind of roll this stuff there similarly. I can do some more heavier lifting with Nifi, a cluster distribution center that's doing some of the interesting stuff at a regional level and then passing some of that stuff on to my core data center. And so I'm taking this same notion of starting very small, passing all the way up through it's very big, learning things, and passing them back again. And so it's a nice way of kind of mapping the mental model to what we're hoping for. And so, we're far from saying we've solved the idea of data flow collection and processing and delivery, but we've gotten a pretty good handle of it. And so now that we have organizations and users making use of the system for a lot of different applications, there's been a lot of interesting things that have come through. We've heard a lot of requests, whether directly or indirectly through mailing lists, meetings, meetups, what have you, and came to the point where we're trying to listen to what people are really looking for. There was a lot of how can I, how do I, and what about. And while by no means, as our Jira tracker would indicate, is this comprehensive, it does cover a lot of the big items that we're looking at solving here. The big one, how do I version my flows? People have become so enamored with Git, I'd like the same kind of thing for Nifi. I want to see my flow, I want to make changes, and then I want to know something's good and be able to share it with some other system. Or if I mess up, I want to be able to roll back. How can I drive continuous integration and continuous deployment processes? Similar kind of thing. I want to upgrade new components, pop them into my flow, and then look at how that works, right? How can I migrate flows between environments? There's a lot of people that are in heavily structured and regulated environments that don't have the ability of doing interactive command control. Instead, they have to kind of go through the appropriate audit process, compliance process, and check everything off on its way from development through staging up to production. And for triage, maybe bring it back down again. How can I provision distributions of Nifi with a set of components? Again, whether it's from the footprint standpoint or if it's a regulatory compliance process, I don't necessarily need to get Twitter when I'm handling people's health records. So right now, we kind of have all those things lumped into one Nifi distribution. It's great out of the box. You can do a whole lot of stuff, but maybe I don't want to, and maybe I don't want to have to bear those larger binaries. How can I make reference to data sets and extensions available to the entirety of a data flow? Think of things that people come accustomed to. If you think of Maven, I can have a POM file associated with my project. I can bring that down, and as long as they were good about designing how that's crafted, I can do a Maven clean package, and it's going to take care of bringing all the things in I need to build my project. It seems like a similar experience, something that's well solved. Maybe we can apply something similar to this as well. As mentioned earlier, looking at certifying, auditing, signing off on flows for those certain environments. And so with that, we kind of took a step back, discussed, there's some conversation. What does a flow really represent in your organization? And so the first thing, we're trying to look at how these messages traverse through. What do we need to capture? Well, as we mentioned, a flow file is that message, that event, at a given juncture in its processing, right? Because I'll make changes to it, and given how we manage that data and pass it through from one point to the next, it may be slightly altered as we make our way through. So that's an interesting kind of bit of thought. Then we look at flow, right? It's that directed graph of processing, again, at a given point in time. So as mentioned before, I have the ability to design, deploy, maybe push things out through command and control. Maybe I can make changes interactively through Nifi itself. So there's other things that come into play. Now I'm looking at each component's configuration. How is that particular processor configured? What assets was it referencing? Was there a certain data set? In the case of geo-enrichment, was that database I'm using at that point in time? What day was that from? If I'm looking at mapping IPs to those locations, those things change constantly. So can I trust the information later when I look at it, maybe 2 weeks ago? What kind of credence does it hold in terms of all of that? And then version. If I'm looking at versioning flows and understanding how all that works, what touched this? What component was it that was going through here? Was its functionality altered? And so it's with that we came about with the idea of the registry. And this is currently in development, design, discussion within the community. And so the idea of the registry is to get some of these things going, right? Provide some of the base functionalities that we can build upon this and expand kind of the ecosystem of Nifi. Allow users to get what they've been asking for and responding to the comments that they've made. So in this case, I've wanted to capture this particular flow, right? I've done something neat here, so I can make a save, right? And so before, if you're familiar with the UI, we'd save these things as templates. And templates work okay, but they weren't the best. And so we'd like to kind of evolve that and make it better. And so when I save that, I can now do interesting things. I can start tagging this. So in this case, I'm calling this a fraud detection flow, and you'll see that there's a little 1 next to it, showing that it's the first version that I'm saving. I can specify a location for it, something that is designed right now to be a pluggable item for different types of stores. If you want to put in Git, if you want to put in S3, all those things should be extensible so that whatever fits your organization, the resources you have, is something that's feasible to use. I want to apply certain certifications to it. Think of this as tagging. In this case, I'm very highly audited. I want to make sure things are working right. So since this is my first kind of take on things, I want to mark it as a POC effort. And so I can save that and then establish my first version. After iterating through it, I can look at evolving this, right? And I've put it through my CI processes, and I've seen that's working. I've used it against sample mock data, and things look good. I'm not doing anything nefarious with the data, and I can sign off of it. So in this case, I can now say that it's compliant, put additional tags on it, and mark this version as production ready. And so I have this original parent issue of the version, and now I have a new version that has a different set of tags associated with it. And so I'm slowly kind of evolving this to move through my different environments. And then at that point, we can do some things where we look at the state of the flow and see how it maps. Based on the components that are on there, can I transition between versions? Maybe I messed up and I want to roll back. Can I switch between the different version that was there? I may have version 2, but I realized that version 1 was actually closer. Let me iterate on that again and try again. And so not only is it flows, it's those other things we talked about as well. Let's hope this animation goes pretty smoothly, but we're looking at getting other things going in here like assets, those reference data sets, extensions. I have certain bundles of processors and components that I'm using in my system. And I get this kind of nice user interface and central point that may be dealing with very disparate resources, but they're all kind of serving the common purpose of flow. and they're all done under that Nifi umbrella, under the same kind of roles and permission systems that we have established. So from an administration perspective, I can then look at, what things are out there. I can filter through and then administer my overall system and look at how these things are managed. We look at registry as an enabler. What we see all these things that we've been hearing and listening to is largely requests for software development lifecycle processes. Let me then build on this work I'm doing with this common functionality of storing these resources off and do things like take care of managing variables, because it's not just the flow that's working in certain environments. My test system has, hopefully, if I'm doing security best practices, a different set of username and password credentials or tickets than my staging or my production environment. I want sensitive properties for those environments too, right? So how can I look at kind of orchestrating all these things so I capture that flow at that juncture for that particular environment? It was highlighted there before, but the extension registry, again, let me get those binary artifacts, those extensions, those bundles of functionality and components, and bring them in. Let me reference a flow, point to all these various things, and then organize one composed package so I can have a custom distribution with just what I need and nothing more. It also enables some powerful framework level things. With that, I can now look at the data and tagging the data with the version of the flow at that point in time. So now I can have ultimate fidelity in understanding what data crafted this flow into the point where it is now. This also brings an enhanced command control experience for Minifi instances. Instead of working with some kind of file repository, I can now reference a flow repository and then use that C2 API to kind of craft a bundle that fits for those agents as well, where resources are incredibly constrained. And so there's this kind of evolution of Apache Nifi. Some fun trivia here. If you've never seen it, the logo on the left was the first one we open sourced. The one after that was what was there presently. And then the current set of logos that we have there are drops in the registry logo that show the transition. Nifi is more than just one application right now. It's additional components that help address this need and the core focus of managing data flow. Things people have come to expect from other tooling that's out there that they want for the same environment. That has a slightly different paradigm about how things are addressed. So, kind of in summation, why the Apache Nifi ecosystem? We're looking at moving data as being multifaceted, and there's a lot of different contexts that make it challenging. Our whole purpose and function is to make that process as seamless as possible and accessible to operations and those folks that necessarily don't want to get into the code. We provide components in the platform with the common tooling, but allow the extensibility to adapt. So for things that make sense, if I want to do JSON, if I want to do XML, we can do those. Those are very common formats. But if I want to do my company's proprietary format, that's fine too. I can do that in a closed off space and share that functionality with my organization. Again, we're all about empowering folks managing your infrastructure to make the changes and reason about issues when they arise. Data provenance, while nice in Nifi, is even nicer if we can extend out to where data is created and then get a full host of the traversal of that information across your infrastructure, all while trying to keep user interface and experience as a key component. Wanted to highlight a couple things that are going on at the conference. There's an Apache Nifi crash course tomorrow. Unfortunately, with the amount of content I wanted to cover, I couldn't go deep into a demo and things like that. But our very talented Yolanda Davis, sitting here in the front row, Apache Nifi PMC member, will be running through how to use Nifi, doing a lab and a more in-depth discussion and demo of how that works. A few caveats here. If you want to come, seats are available on the first come, first served basis, and try and have the latest version of VirtualBox installed. There will be a Birds of a Feather session on Thursday. If you haven't been to one before, it's just an opportunity to talk about IoT streaming type things. Yolanda will be there. Daver from Apache Beam will be there as well. Great opportunity to just talk with like-minded folks about different things that are going on there and hear some really bad puns about streaming. Finally, these are some of the kind of higher level points. I think that we take a lot of pride in being a very open community in terms of getting people involved. So I invite you to come join us on the mailing list. Recently we set up a HIP chat room through ASF. Come talk to us on there. Join us on the mailing list. We love hearing that things are great. If things stink, definitely tell us about those. We'd like to make those better, and we'd love to have a discussion with you. If you are moving data and you aren't quite sure or something feels wrong, we'd love to hear about it. So share that with us. We'd love to discuss it with you. think we have a few minutes for questions. Otherwise, I just want to thank you so much for joining with me today. Hope to hear you in the community. And thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the conference. Yes?
I have a specific question around COBOL acidic files.
Okay.
So, do you guys have any plugins, or how do you support fixed length variable and COBOL acidic files?
I am not going to act like I'm an expert. The question was about handling COBOL episodic files, is that correct? I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on those items, so I'm not sure. So the character conversion type format, we have a processor that does handle character conversion. That might be an option. I don't know enough of the specifics in terms of that format, in terms of what's involved with that. But if you want to reach out and drop us a line on the mailing list, we'd be happy to kind of point you in the right direction and see what's going on there. I'm not my area of expertise on that particular matter, though. Yep. Question?
Do you have a rough idea when a first take of the registry will be available for folks to use? I mean, days, weeks, months, years?
So the question was a rough take of when the availability of the registry would be. It's one of the things that there's a fantastic document that someone in the community made that's available on our wiki that has a lot of great design thoughts and ideas there. I know based on some of the Jira traffic I've seen, there's some initial work going into the UI and some of the backing things there. So I'm not going to also act like I'm an expert at software estimates, but I think months is probably the right scale for something that's fully usable. I think there'll be some kind of preview cuts sooner than that, but something that's probably has the utility that we're looking for and kind of talking about here is probably a little farther off. Next question.
Is there an overlap in features between Nifi, Storm, Spark, Kafka? Because there all seem to be data graph processors that you can configure. How do you see this overlap working out?
Okay. The question was about the overlap between Nifi, Kafka, Storm, Spark. If there was any, and kind of how my view of that landscape is, there certainly can be overlap. One of the things I will say is that the kind of default answer we always give to this question, if you're familiar with simple event processing versus complex event processing, simple event processing is very much like these processors I was mentioning, from the standpoint that's very functional. That black box gets some input, applies some work to it, and then kicks something out the other side. So that's not to say that it's simple from the sake of computation, but it's simple from the standpoint of it's a very functional kind of nature applied to it. Complex event processing, by contrast, is typically looking at aggregations, windowing, things like that. That's something that Nifi is not going after, will not be doing. We try and stick very much in this kind of functional domain. It can be very complex, but we're looking at things like enrichment, transforms, those types of things. So there is some of that. There's some of the work that came out recently that also helps that. So if you're looking at joining streams, like I call it to some service and enrich this, that's fair game. If I'm looking at doing large windows of things and holding things in memory, that's probably not. And so that's, Storm and Spark are great for those particular items. Kafka, we find a lot of our users of Nifi. Kafka and Nifi kind of go hand in hand. We see a lot of people that use Nifi for these simple event processing features that do the transforms, get data ready in the format they need to feed those systems. And then when we're sending things off to like Storm or Spark, we'll put it onto Kafka, and Kafka will then act as like that substrate that does makes the data available across to those larger systems. So I think I'm out of time. I'm happy to keep chatting. You can also look for us around here with Nifi shirts, although we gave a bunch out, so there might be other people who might not know as much, but still ask them questions. They should have some stickers. So happy to chat more, but thanks again for coming out, and have a great rest of the day.